Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we're going to be looking at the Knoxville and Melbourne Regional Championship results. They happened on the same weekend, and some pretty interesting stuff list-wise, as well as decks which are present and possibly not present as well among the top 8 and top 32s. So going to be getting into the nitty-gritty, but we will be starting off with the overall day 1 and day 2 data, and this is for Knoxville, slightly smaller tournaments in our current standards, but still a 1,358 player tournament is massive. For me, that's like an IC number in my head, which is pretty crazy, honestly. Charizard continues to be the most popular deck, still around that 16-17% that we've seen over the last few tournaments. Roaring Moon shot up in popularity. I believe it was on the graphic as like 4th or 5th most popular in the previous weeks, and has now sort of overshadowed Miraidon as that like aggressive beat stick style archetype. The matchup spread for Roaring Moon is slightly different. I think it's trying to prey on Giratina, also good into the Miraidon, which is interesting. Obviously it's still got that great type coverage into Mew, which isn't on the graphic but still is around that sort of 6% deck in the room. And although Gardevoir looks like a bad matchup on paper, because you have those coin flips, sometimes you can just really aggressively take out multi-prizes on the opponent's side of the field and be okay into that matchup. So yeah, the new Pokemon catchers that we'll see do well in some of the top 8 lists is going to be interesting to follow as well for Roaring Moon. I think when Paradox Rift first dropped, there was a lot of hype, a lot of attention around this archetype, but it's been in the more recent weeks where it's really found its footing. Interesting to see Lost Zone Box almost as popular as Lost Zone Giratina as well, with Tina being that almost 13%, Lost Box being the next most popular with that 10%, with Gardevoir and Miraidon still in that mix. It's an interesting metagame placement for Gardevoir. It appreciates Roaring Moon being more popular than Miraidon, but it's a really weird metagame placement for Miraidon because even though people may be more incentivized to play Gardevoir, there's gonna naturally be more Roaring Moon in the room, which is like a bad matchup for you, and we still know that Charizard is gonna be the most popular deck in pretty much any tournament in this metagame, so it's a bit of a head scratcher. Let me know if you think Miraidon's like a better play going into the next week, because I'm actually playing in Dortmund myself, and it's a consideration for myself right now. Knoxville also gave us a secondary graphic here for the next most popular archetype, so it does give us more of a full view of what was played in the room. So Mew still at that 7%, very similar to Miraidon in that play rate, a little bit lower than the last few tournaments that we have seen. Obviously Mew had just done well the previous week, which means everyone's on red alert with their Spiritomb decks, with their Drapions, and Roaring Moon being more popular. Even though Mew is one of the most powerful decks in a vacuum, it does feel like you have to pick your moments for this deck and pick the right tournament for it, and possibly players decided that wasn't this weekend. Then we have these 4 and 3%ers for the Goldengos, Snorlax, Chien-Pao, and I Am Valiant with a 2.4%, which is quite interesting because I haven't had any results in a while, but we will see one today. And don't get too excited by the unknown V-Star, it's just showing off the unclassified category. Taking all that information from day 1 then and converting it to day 2, Roaring Moon had an insane conversion rate, which is really, really interesting. Big drop off for Charizard as well. I think this is one of the weakest tournaments for Charizard overall, not just the day 1 to day 2, but also converting into those higher places that we'll look at in a moment. It was actually a really rough day for Charizard overall, and Roaring Moon really announcing itself as one of the top contenders, very high in day 1 popularity, but unlike at the LEIC where Roaring Moon was very popular and dropped off, it's been popular and also succeeding more than most archetypes by a long way. So we've seen a top 8 here and there, but now it seems to have really put itself on the map as a top contender. Lost Zone Box doing pretty okay. Gardevoir's conversion was positive. Mew's was negative, but less negative than other archetypes like Miraidon, so it does work its way onto the graphic, which is pretty interesting. Another thing to note is that Roaring Moon's popularity has also really scared away Rapid Strike, I think, for the most part. Possibly Mew has helped with that endeavor as well. But Rapid Strike was once this like constantly finding its way onto the day 2 graphic of archetypes, and it seems to have really gone under the radar as of late because the metagame shifted unfavorably. And then for that more full picture for the day 2 placements, Limitless has released this lovely graphic here where we see after the Mew that Snorlax was right behind it, so that actually had a pretty good conversion. Chien-Pao also converting quite nicely, Miraidon having a bit of a poor showing, to be honest with you, and then 15 in that other category. It's a smuttering of like Goldengo, Arceus, Clorf, one Lugia, which is kind of interesting, so all in their sort of 1s and 2s, nothing really too noteworthy there. So getting into the deck list themselves then, congratulations to Ryan Antonucci on their first regionals victory. They have made top 8 before and are quite experienced with Gardevoir. I have been playing it for a number of months now and has come to a really good list, I think. This is just one card different from Tord's most recent 60, where it's flip-flopped a research for a worker. So we already had that really good consistency shell, and that sort of worker versus research is somewhat of like a metagame call where you just want to have more path bouncers in general, perhaps. So it definitely seems like a justifiable decision right now. Raymond Long, also off a hot top 16 finish, has continued to play Gardevoir to another really solid placement. A few more differences here where it is still playing the 2 research, but has added in the worker as an additional supports card in the mix, has reduced down that candy count. I think it's also found the way to fit Cress and Jirachi in here for the double whammy against the Lost Zone engines, but nothing too surprising apart from that. Aiden Koos finds himself back in a final, this time unfortunately not able to take the win, but has been playing Lost Box for a decent amount of time and has brought back pretty much an old faithful really in the Kyogre build that has a couple of those V Pokemon splashed in with those Forest Hill Stone. We have the Dragonite as that aggressive attacking option, with Dragon Gale able to reach that 250, which is still a really, really important number in the game right now, and Pidgeot being the option to just jump back into the deck when need be as well. The most recent tech inclusion for a number of these Lost Box builds has been the Mawile. Tempting Trap can really catch the likes of Gardevoir players and Charizard players slipping if they have already played their outs or don't play enough outs to get around the Mawile trapping line. The Pidgeot V also helps enable this deck out strategy via the Tempting Trap, and there are a number of Charizard builds which aren't playing Lost City, which means that even if Charizard players do have one out, you can recycle it with Super Rod and try again. Beyond this cheeky strategy though, it is still at the end of the day going to have the options to be Turbo when required, but also has that Aqua Storm, which is going to be really strong right now. Really enjoy seeing Roaring Moon in the mix now as well. I think that is a really good matchup, and Kyogre is busted in that situation. So it's not surprising, seeing the day 2 field, how favourable it would have been for a Kyogre deck that Aiden made it so far in the tournament. Giratina and indeed Ian Robb had to just settle for a top 4 placement this time around, but the list is also looking pretty solid. Nothing too surprising here. Ian is choosing to play a couple of the little basic techs, the Manaphy and the Spiritomb, and has also decided to fit in the Avery alongside the staple supporters. In order to make the space, they have cut down to just 2 Water Energy, which I think is a little sus, but is somewhat reasonable with these tech inclusions in their place. Jackson Ford was also able to make top 8 with Giratina and also chose to play the Spiritomb tech inclusion, but rather than Manaphy and Avery, they're sticking with the extra Water Energy and an extra switch out. These accounts we've seen in the past and are super reasonable for Giratina overall. Roaring Moon did convert from its really nice day 1 to day 2 to also making a couple placements in top 8. Jose Marzan was able to make top 8 with Roaring Moon. Some strange trivia is that both Jose and Aiden were able to make top 8 together in a previous tournament. It was the Charlotte Regionals when they both played the Eternatus Weezing deck. I thought that was a really strange coincidence. But getting into the list, it is very aggressive with the quad trekking shoes, the quad Pokemon catcher, and is generally in keeping with the Cawthorn approach of having heavy research and energy switch alongside a couple copies of Sada to weave in throughout the game. With this aggressive build, you do sacrifice your tools, and especially Emergency Jelly, which I think is a massive card against Giratina. So you are leaning into flipping some heads and knocking out some basic V-Tinas in the matchup, but you do gain sort of more overall synergy by not having to weave in like a couple copies of Town Store and this, that, and the other, and simply increase your ratios of hitting item cards. Kamal, however, was our other Roaring Moon top 8 placer and is continuing with the old faithful Ross Cawthorn build, and it's continuing to impress. We end on Tyler Matthews' Entei Valiant, and a certainly interesting one here, where we've had the 1-1 Bibarel come into the deck list, and a really interesting support account as well. Typically, you would see Colrus alongside your researches just for extra dig into the deck, but with Bibarel, the Iona becomes a much stronger option because you're not a detriment to yourself. And the Serena's an interesting one. Obviously, it's not as good as a Boss's Orders in terms of that gusting option, but sometimes it gets the job done into enough targets, and it is a tiny bit of panic draw when required. We have some really thin attacking lines, just 2 Entei V in the list, but at the very least there is a Super Rod to try and reload, certainly Radzard, but also these Enteis when needed. For the other talking points of Knoxville, Charizard not only had a bad day 1 to 2 conversion, there was also only one player, Isaiah, with a list in the top 32. There was one in 33rd as well, so maybe a bit facetious. But yeah, Charizard had a really bad day at the office. I think it's been pretty solidly tier A or tier S in most people's opinions, and this is the first time we've started to see a shift in that narrative. Even though Miraidon had a pretty poor showing overall, it did manage 1 top 16 placement, and it was an interesting list that played both Beach Court and 1 copy of Path of the Peak. Jared's done it again, and I think he's going to ride Chien-Pao the entire season. Piper played a really interesting Glasses box, quite similar to Magnus Pedersen's most recent 60, and LDF got a top 32 placement with the Cheese String. Shifting our attention to the Melbourne Regional Championships, we do have the Day 2 breakdown. No Day 1 breakdown, unfortunately, because there wasn't an official stream, but this is what all the Day 2 decks look like. Giratina and Gardevoir doing quite well. Charizard still up in that mix. Lost Zone box, Roaring Moon again showing up. We had 4 Mews, 2 Goldengos, and then we had 5 individual decks rounding out our day 2. As for the top 8 then, Brent, after getting a second place at Liverpool, comes back and gets the dub, has thrown in the poker gears, gets rewarded with extra consistency, and gets a victory. Congrats to Brent, he is proving time and time again that he is a ruthless competitor and one of the strongest players that we have in the game. Similar for Harrow as well, they're kind of doing a world tour and have been showing up in all sorts of tournaments in the last couple of years, and we see another really great placement with Charizard Pidgeot. They've actually got second at another Australian event with the same archetype, so it's pretty locked in with Charizard Pidgeot and is having another great showing. Nothing too outlandish with the 60, except for the fact that it only plays 2 copies of Arven and is going up in just regular ball search count to get into the game when you are forced first. Natalie Miller was able to get a top 4 placement with a 0 VIP pass build of Gardevoir. Natalie playing a really interesting third copy of Reversal Energy. Beyond that, it's pretty staple counts, and it seems like more and more Gardevoir players are settling on a similar support account to this one. There was one other Gardevoir and 2 more Giratinas in the top 8, but not too much to write home about there. Tim Franklin was playing a really interesting Moon Hands Lost box here. Interestingly, has kept Dragonite as the V option to have Forest Stone rather than having the Galarian Moltres, which we often see alongside Roaring Moon. Another thing that stood out to me was the Quad Rod. I think it's a really solid option when you are trying to reload gates so much with this list. And then stealing the show in top 8 is Nigel Tam with the comeback of Lugia of all things. It is the colourless build, has incorporated the Cobalion to help push your damage output here and there, has the Radzard option, has the Luxray with the Swelling Flash combo as well. It's playing the triple Burnett. I don't expect many people to jump on this bandwagon once again, but it's interesting to see that Lugia can still be a top performer in this format. It is still boasting a number of great type coverages, and it still has a number of really solid single prize attacking options when need be. I think the other big story from Melbourne was that there was a Gardevoir Mewtwo V Union that made top 16 as well. It's playing a couple Zinnias to give you even more discard synergy to get these guys in the discard pile early. It's got Luxray as an alternative attacker and provides type coverage into Pidgeot, which is kind of interesting. And it even has the free retreat Cleffa in here for the grasping draw. I'm surprised to see it over the likes of Mew, but hey, whatever works for you. Let me know your thoughts down below for both the tournaments we looked at today. Hope you enjoyed, and I'm going to be coming back with my thoughts pre-Dortmund, which is the first Paldean Fates legal tournament, so I might be touching on some top tier tweaks before the end of the week. Hope you enjoyed today's video, and I'll see you tomorrow for another one. Cheers.